Hello everyone, thanks for joining me today. This video is the first in a series that I'm going to start doing about Age of Empires 2 game mechanics. Not the mechanics of like civilizations and units and all how that works. I think that's pretty well understood by now, but more about the mechanics behind the scenes. The kind of stuff that makes the game function that a lot of people don't even realize or think about and don't understand. But those things that understanding them can often give you a big leg up, at the very least help you to kind of understand how things work better. When I first started working on a mod about 6 months ago, I was completely new to how a lot of these things functioned, and I found to my frustration that there are very few good guides out there for anything newer than Age of Kings and the Conqueror's expansion, which by now are decades old and pretty much totally useless. So I had to basically figure them out through trial and error and a lot of effort and a lot of time. Now, by now I've come to understand these core game mechanics really well, to the point where I can match the developers for pretty much any AI behavior or scenario mechanics. So I decided to start creating some new guides and hopefully make these things a lot easier to understand. So today we're going to be starting with one of my favorite AOE2 mechanics, and that is triggers. Triggers are, for most people, pretty mysterious and arcane and really confusing. Just things in the scenario editor that are there but don't make any sense, and I'm sure a lot of people have messed around with them from time to time, but not really been able to figure out how to make them work or what they do or all the different functions here. But they are a core element of level design and scenario creation, anything like that, anything to do with actually creating functional scenarios. You can get a pretty map all you want, but if you can't get triggers working, then you don't really have much. So let's start with the very basics. What are triggers? Simply put, triggers are scenario instructions that tell the game to do certain things. They're instructions that override the standard behavior of the AI and of the way that things function, and that act as the building blocks for any functional scenario. Everything that happens in AoE2 that is not directly player controlled is controlled by one of two things, scripts and triggers. Scripts are something we'll get to in the future probably, but they essentially control the AI, the way it behaves, what its priorities are. They basically do for the AI what the player does for themselves in terms of thinking and planning and acting accordingly. Triggers, on the other hand, control the behavior of a scenario specifically. They can be used in conjunction with scripts, and usually are, but they control what happens in a given scenario. They can be used to, for example, create objects, direct what a building trains or how fast it trains. They can direct where units go, what they do, even adjust a lot of the core building and unit values like attack, speed, range, line of sight, training time, etc. Basically, they are modifiers that can make the game do pretty much whatever you want. If there's a value that's in there that's created in the default game, it can probably be modified somehow with triggers if you know what you're doing. First, let's take a look at the trigger window. Here I have a generic scenario editor window, totally empty, just exactly what you get when you first open up a blank scenario. First, let's tab over to the Triggers tab. If you don't know, you can use the function keys to move between tabs. This is F1, F2, and then Triggers is F10. I would encourage you to follow along if you want, and even pause the video to see if you can set up some of these triggers before I show you. So as we can see, the Triggers tab is broken into two main parts, Scenario Triggers and Conditions and Effects. The top window here is where the triggers themselves go, and the bottom window down here is what the parts of those triggers. Currently we have no triggers at all, so the window shows none, just meaning that there's nothing here. If we click the new button, we see a trigger appear called Trigger 0. Along with the new button, we can see three other buttons, Copy, Info, and Delete. We'll get to those in a minute, although they're pretty self-explanatory. For now, let's take a look at our trigger. As we can see, it's currently colored red. Red means that it's not functional. something is wrong and the trigger can't be processed. Right now, this is because all we've done is create the shell of the trigger. It's completely empty and doesn't actually give any directions or anything to do. So that's where this bottom window comes in. Put simply, conditions tell the trigger what to activate, rather, what activates the trigger, and effects tell it what to do. So conditions tell it when to activate, effects tell it what it is supposed to activate. If we click the top two buttons here, we see that two lines appear. Conditions will always appear above effects no matter how many you have or what order. So conditions will always appear on top and then effects. So if we look down at the conditions tab, we see that we have the conditions list here, which is a list of all possible conditions. There's this list here. Same for the effects list. If we go down here, effects list, there's quite a few more of them. We get all of these different effects here, all the way down. Quite a lot of them here. Now, back up to the trigger for a second. If we click the info button, that's the same as clicking the trigger. It just shows us the trigger information. We're going to ignore everything over here for now and just focus on this far right column. So name here is simply the name of your trigger. This is super useful if you're designing anything, if you have dozens of triggers, sometimes over 100 on a couple of my scenarios, and you need to keep them organized and be able to quickly tell what ones are connected and what goes where. Super useful really quickly. And then below this, we have two pairs of buttons. We have the trigger starting state and the trigger looping. So trigger starting state is pretty simple, on or off. This tells it whether this trigger is supposed to start active or inactive. So on is the default state, and that means that the trigger will be on. Means that as soon as this condition, whatever it is activated, that the trigger will fire. If this starting state is set to off, then it means that trigger will not be active, and another trigger will need to activate it in order for it to become active. So even if the condition is met, it won't work unless it's activated by another trigger whose effect is to activate it. Typically speaking, unless you know what you're doing, you're going to just want to leave it on. And then down here, trigger looping. So trigger looping is pretty much what it sounds like it might be. If the trigger looping is off, which is default, then it will fire, as it actually says over in the corner there, it will fire only once if it is active and the conditions are met, whereas if trigger looping is set to yes, it will fire repeatedly if it is active and its conditions are met. So if the condition is to own a certain number of objects, and looping is set to yes, then it will continue to fire that effect until that is no longer the case, until that condition is no longer met. So that's pretty simple. Just the very basics of triggers. Typically, you have trigger starting state on and trigger looping off, unless you specifically know what you're doing, although there are very reasonable use cases for both. And the default for triggers is 1 per second, so triggers fire 1 time per second if they're on a loop. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's actually see some triggers. There are a lot of possible combinations, but let's start with something simple. Let's say we have a knight that we want to send on patrol, but we're lazy and we don't want to click all those 4 times to make it work ourselves. So instead we can use triggers. You can see up here that I have this trigger called Night Patrol. I always name my triggers just out of habit. If you're working with 1 or 2, it's not a big deal, but I would suggest it just to keep things straight if you ever get into more advanced territory. So first, let's start with our condition. There are a lot of them, but let's start with the simplest and probably one of the most common, which is the timer. So the timer runs in seconds. So you can see the default here is 10 seconds. The timer value can go up all the way up to, I believe, 2 to the 32nd, which is like a lot. So you don't ever have to worry about having too much time on the timer. So let's use 3 because I'm impatient, don't want to wait. Next, our effect. This is a little more complicated. There are a few ways to do this, 2 main ways to do it, the way that we want to. One of them is to simply use the patrol effect, which you can actually type a letter on your keyboard and it'll jump down to the first of that letter in the list. So we can use the patrol effect if we want to. The other option is to use the task object effect, which has a lot more capabilities. but we're keeping it simple, so let's use the patrol effect. So now we see a lot of menus, but don't worry, it's way simpler than it looks. So starting from the top, the source player is simply the player being affected. So in that case, this is player 1. Uh, the next 4 menus are simply ways of narrowing down which objects are being affected, done in a few different intersecting ways. So starting from the top left, the object list type is broken down into units, buildings, heroes, and others, which is the same as over here, units, building, hero, other. And then you have the object list down here, which breaks down into the specific objects. So for example, here, if we type the K, it'll take us down and we have knight. So it's specifically the object list type is the unit, and the object list is specifically a knight. We also have these two over here, which are less frequent, but that are used relatively often. We will use them later on here in this video. So we have the object group with things you can see here like archers, cavalry, infantry, all of these different object classes. So these are classes. So if you know what class your object is, you can narrow it down a little more. And then object type, building, civilian, military, other. Again, buildings are buildings, military are military units. Civilians are things like villagers, trade cards, fishing ships, anything that's not a combat unit. And then others are the miscellaneous things, like, for example, this flag here. But we're going to keep this pretty simple. So right now, object type units, knight, and that's all we need from here. Over here on the right, set objects. This allows you to specifically select more specific objects. Set objects, and then we can click here, and you see reset, go to objects, and now we have this specific knight here. Set area allows you to set the area in which you want these conditions to apply. So, for example, now only knights in this area will be affected, as opposed to all knights from player 1 on the field. And then set location is where you want the knight to go. So in this case, here. So now we've set the location on the flag, we have set the specific object type. And so right now what this trigger is saying is knights from player 1 are to patrol from wherever they're starting to this flag. So let's take a look and see what we see here. So we can see here, I have my UI off so you can't see, but the game is paused. But I'm going to hit the unpause key here in a second, and we're going to count and see what we see. So we're going to unpause, and we can see 1, 2, 3. And I was a little off there, but you see that the knight takes off and begins his patrol, and he'll go back to where he started. And just like that, without actually telling him to do anything, he automatically starts patrolling, and he will keep doing that forever unless he's interrupted. And then he will actually, we're going to see this right here, on plan, but perfect demonstration, where he's going to go kill that villager, and then he's going to go back to his patrol route, because that's what he's supposed to do. Again, I forgot to remove player 2, but this is perfect timing. He's going to chase down that guy, and now he's going to start attacking them, but that's enough. You can see what we are intending here. Alright, let's try something a little more complicated. Let's say we want the knight to move to the flag, just like before, and then veer off and attack this wall over here. So first, let's consider what we're doing in game terms. First, we're telling the knight to move to a specific point, which is right here at this flag. Then, we're telling him to attack an object, which is this wall up here. So let's adjust our triggers. We need 2 this time, 1 to reach the flag and 1 to reach the house. If you want to try for yourself, go ahead and pause and see if you can get it yourself. Alright, so first we can adjust our existing control trigger. I actually deleted it, but it's fine. We can just basically use the same trigger that we already had. So instead of patrolling, we now want the much more versatile task object effect. So we can set our timer back to the same 3 seconds. And so task object, we have all the same things here. We can go down, click on player 1's knight, set object just for additional verification. Now we have down here the action type. You can see there's a lot of them here. Most of these aren't relevant. Basically, the only ones I ever typically use are default, move, um, and sometimes like guard, follow, or work. Like these are for trebuchets. These are attack move is a good one too. These are for formations. There's a lot here. You can kind of play around with them if you want, but let's go with default, which is just default action. So basically, now this timer, we will set the location since we have to reset to here. So now his default action is to move to there. So basically, it's this timer, 3 seconds, and the knight will move to the flag. And now we can actually click copy, which will copy the trigger, but not the name for whatever reason. And we can just name it knight attack. So now we move on to the second trigger. Now we have to ask ourselves, how do we get the knight to come over here? Timer doesn't work anymore because we're asking the knight to move once he reaches a specific location. So instead, we will use one of a couple commands. The one that I prefer in this case would be objects in area. So set area, and we can do, just to give a little more space, we do this here. So now once he reaches this space, and we set this to 1, so that we have one player, one object in this area. And then we can once again task object. We have set objects, and instead of set location, we go here, and our default. But one more thing. Flags count as objects. So in this case, we actually have it at 1. We actually need to go to 2, because this is 1, this will be 2. And so now what we have is 2 triggers, both active. After 3 seconds, the knight will be tasked to move from here to here, and then once he reaches this location, he will be tasked to go off to the side here. So let's check it out and see what we get. Alright, so now we have, you can see this is set up. We have the knight, we have the flag, and over here off to the side where we can't see, we have the wall. So one thing that we do need to note that I forgot to tell you is that if you try to do it as I showed you, you will immediately win because there's no player 2 objects. So instead you have to set the player 2 object. I typically use an invisible object, which just does not move and cannot be interacted with, but also counts as an object to prevent player 2 from being defeated. Basically, it's a way to keep player 2 active without ever actually existing. But with that said, let's take a look. The game is paused, so we're going to unpause. 1, 2, 3, and the knight takes off. And as soon as he gets in that area, he veers off to the right, and he attacks the wall. And you notice that even though he couldn't see the wall, you notice that he would still go off to attack it. And that's one of the keys of triggers, is that players and units don't have to be able to see objects in order to be able to reach them. The player doesn't have to have vision on them, and the unit in question doesn't have to have line of sight. It is very helpful to remember. Alright, now let's do one more thing before we wrap this video up. A little bit more complicated, but a fair bit more interesting than just patrolling knights and stuff like that. So let's say we have this enemy town here, just sitting in the open. Don't fault me for my design, I am not good at designing towns, but just let's say this little town here that we want to capture. And what we want to do is set things up so that any unit of a different player that reaches the town center here, kind of right in the middle, can capture the entire town. And so that may seem a little bit complicated, but it really isn't. It only requires one effect that we haven't used yet. So if you want to, you can pause the video and take a look and see if you can figure out how to do that yourself. Everyone ready? Alright, so first we go with our new effect. First thing's our condition. Either the bring object to area or the bring objects in area command will work here. Either one really works, but objects in area works for objects that aren't created yet, whereas bring object to area, you see you have to select a specific object, whereas objects in area can be any object you can choose, even objects that aren't created yet. So that's the one I prefer. Let's set this box right here in the middle, kind of be generous about it. So we'll set that box right in the middle of the town center. And so right now, any player 1 unit, and we can set this up here again to 1. So any player 1 unit that reaches the center of this box will trigger whatever the effect's going to be. And we notice here we have object state alive. Don't worry about that. You basically never need to change it off alive unless you very specifically do, but then you really should know what you're doing if you're going to need to do that. All right, so next we can use our effect. This is our final new effect here, and this is the change ownership effect right here. So change ownership, first things first, set area, and we're going to go from one corner of the wall, if I can actually draw, all the way out here. And now everything in this box is in the area. So source player is player 1 here. That is actually going to be player 2, and vice versa. Source player is the player we're going to be taking from. Target player is the player it's going to be going to. So in this case, when it's set to units like this, with everything else empty, that includes everything, all objects, all buildings, all military units, everything. So we can just leave it like that. And so right now we have this selected. So as soon as we bring a player 1 object, a unit of any kind, into this middle box, this here, all of it, should change to player 1. So let's take a look and see what happens. Alright, so we see here, because I forgot to pick a specific player, it's been just going random, and this time it grabbed the Vietnamese, who actually see opponents at the start of game, so that's why it's showing you the town center there, because this is the Vietnamese. But so we see here the game is paused, but if we move this knight, we click here, and it doesn't have to stop, it just has to pass through. So we click over there to overshoot, we unpause, and we see what happens. And we can see him enter, and the moment he gets in, suddenly everything changes to our side. And just like that, you've successfully set up a town that can be converted just like that one level of Vlad Dracula, which is where I got the inspiration, where you can basically play a game of Risk. So that's going to be it for this video. There were a bunch more things I wanted to do, but I didn't realize how much I like to talk, and so ended up basically at double time. So I'm just going to wrap this up right here before we end up at like 3 hours, and encourage you all to play around and see if you can't figure out some more stuff for yourselves. For example, if you want to set up getting a unit to follow an AI unit, or if you want to set up getting it so that town we just created can go back and forth from player 2 to player 1 and back to player 2, things like that. Just experiment with triggers and effects and conditions and all of that. And in the next part, we will pick up with some of the more advanced effects and how to chain triggers together and look into using things like trigger looping and trigger starting states and things like that. So until next time, thanks for joining me, and I will see everyone in the next part of the series.